So to begin, I will give an overview of the flow of this process. Um, so we have 2 hours together. I'll begin with the committee introductions. I will read the bios so that you know something of our backgrounds and our relationship to the dissertation subject. Then I'll give a very brief introduction of Kimberly's presentation. And then Kimberly will present on her research for about 45 minutes or so. And then after that, the committee will ask questions. We'll have 2 rounds of questions from the committee. And after that, it'll be opened up to the audience for your questions and conversations with Kimberly. The committee will leave this Zoom space and go into another Zoom space for our deliberation and conversation, and then we come back in with our recommendations. So to begin, I like to do the bios. So Venus E. Evans Winters is a licensed clinical social worker and PhD, is the Black Girls Initiatives Research Coordinator at the African American Policy Forum. She's also a visiting professor of education at The Ohio State University. Her areas of research are educational policy analysis, Black girls and women's ontoepistemologies, and critical race feminist methodologies. She is the author of Black Feminism and Qualitative Inquiry, a mosaic for writing our daughter's body and teaching Black girls, resilience in urban schools, and co-author of Introduction to Intersectional Qualitative Research. She is co-editor of the books Black Feminism in Education, Black Women Speak Up, Back and Out, and Celebrating 20 Years of Black Girlhood, the Lauryn Hill Reader. Dr. Evans Winters is also a clinical psychotherapist in private practice and the founder of Planet Venus Institute. Our next committee member is Dr. Alka Arora. Alka Arora has a doctorate in women's studies from the University of Washington and a bachelor's degree in mathematics from the University of Southern California. Dr. Arora is an associate professor of the Women's Spirituality Program at CIIS, where she has been teaching since 2011. Her research and teaching interests include integral feminist pedagogy, spiritual activism, decolonial animal ethics, and women's leadership. Her most recent publication, Pedagogy of the Consumed, an integral feminist lens on veganism in higher education, was published in the book Feminist Animal and Multi-Species Studies in 2003. Alka is a certified gender equity and reconciliation international facilitator, and in 2018 helped develop the organization's first gender healing workshop specifically for people of color. Dr. Arora is also a public speaker and leadership coach. As for me, I am associate professor and chair of the Women's Spirituality PhD program and the Women, Gender, Spirituality, and Social Justice MA program at CIIS. My doctorate is in philosophy and religion with specialization in women's spirituality. Research interests have centered on the theme of women's spiritual power and agency within the Yoruba Ifa tradition and on soul healing from sexual trauma. Among others, I've authored The Divine Feminine in Yoruba Cosmology, found in Goddesses in Myth, History, and Culture, Wisdom of the Primordial Feminine, Wisdom of Women, Odu Ifa, and Yoruba Religious Tradition, in Philosophia, Wisdom Goddess Traditions, and Deconstruction and Reclamation, a Healing Journey in Spiritual Healing from Sexual Violence and Intersectional Guide. So there you have the committee. So by way of introduction, I'll say that as gleaned from the abstract of Kimberly's work, the dissertation addresses the importance of embodied spiritualities in the lives of a multi-generational cross-section of Black women, and the means by which embodied spiritualities can be employed as a healing modality for the multi-layered impacts of historical and intergenerational trauma within this population. And with that teaser, I now turn it over to Kimberly to present on her dissertation, Soul to Soul Healing, a phenomenological study on reclaiming and reimagining embodied spiritualities to heal historical and intergenerational trauma in Black women. Kimberly.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I am going to share my screens. So I like to just take a deep breath. I'm a little unhinged right now. And so I invite you to take a deep breath with me as a collective, to be able to ground into our bodies and to receive this information from our hearts, from my heart to your heart. So I invite you to take a deep breath in, belly breath in, bring it to the heart, softly exhale it out. Another deep breath in, hold it in the heart, softly exhale it out. And one more deep breath in. Hold it in your heart, and then softly exhale it out. So hopefully you all feel better. I know that I do. And so let's get started. And so I thank you, Dr. Williams, for the introduction and to explain a little bit about my study, which has been a labor of love and healing for the last 6 years. And so before I begin, I want to acknowledge the creator, the forces of the universe, of all that is seen and unseen, which is created, nurtured, directed, and sustained by Great Mommy. I would like to acknowledge the lands that nurtured and grounded me during this 6-year process. The Potawatomi lands in Illinois, the Hohokam lands of Arizona, the Ohlone lands of California. And I would like to thank my ancestors for being an integral part of this journey, motivating, encouraging, and pouring into me as I created this work. In particular, I want to name my father, Macomb Burns, my grandmother, Thelma Dean Lloyd, my grandmother, Lucy Freeman, my great aunt, Etherly Rush, and my beloved nephew, Khalid Kai Malik Davis, whose photograph you see here. I lost my nephew at the age of 21 in 2020 to suicide in the midst of doing this work. He was a brilliant student, scholar, author, and promising social justice activist. Prior to his passing, he read my literature review. He was one of the only people in my personal circle who enthusiastically read and showed a genuine interest in my work. And I hold that memory near and dear to my heart, and I am grateful that he continues to be a force of love, support, and wisdom for me as I navigate the complex spaces of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational healing. Thank you. All right, so I was on the land acknowledgements. I'll go through that really quickly since I'm already behind. Potawatomi lands, Hohokam lands, Ohlone lands. I was speaking about my nephew. And so I would also like to acknowledge my mother, who I believe is on here, for instilling in me the importance of education as an act of empowerment and liberation. And I would like to acknowledge my 2 sons, Christian and Kevin, who reflect back to me the effects of my own intergenerational trauma and the power of intergenerational healing. And I would also like to acknowledge my chosen daughter, Brittany, who has taken on the difficult challenge of being a generational pattern breaker, interrupter, and healer. I am forever grateful that she chose me to be her confidant during this lifetime. And I want to acknowledge my family, my friends, and my partner for being patient with me and supporting me in navigating the completion of this work. This has been such a journey of sorrow and joy and pain and healing and loss and recovery, deception and truth, isolation, community, like all of those things. I would like to also acknowledge I have quite a few of my chosen sisters in this PhD journey. And so I want to acknowledge them, because without their love and support and encouragement throughout this 6-year time period, I would not be here in front of you. I would like to thank the professors, or acknowledge the professors and mentors who have been a force of knowledge and encouragement and support for me. Dr. Mara Keller, may she continue to rest in power. Dr. Annette Williams, Dr. Alka Aurora, and Dr. Venus Evans Winters. I would also like to acknowledge the Divine Eight, and I call them the Divine Eight. These are my research participants and cohort of Black women who courageously offered their time and stories to advance this work. And lastly, I want to acknowledge my mind, body, and spirit for surrendering to the sacredness of this lived experience and sustaining me. And I acknowledge the grace and privilege that my body has offered me by bringing all aspects of myself into this work. So thank you. So I'm trying to shake off all the jitters. And again, I apologize for the technology snafu. So overview, we're going to go over the thesis, the background, definition, the key terms, literary review, theoretical framework. I'll talk to you about the research participants, the findings, the conclusion, recommendations, and references. So this just gives you a brief roadmap of where we're going today. So thank you. And so in this dissertation, I posit that the antidote to embodied trauma is embodied spiritual healing. And although Black women have an innate, complex, and unique relationship with spirit that fuels our resiliency, I argue that a ritualized connection to spirit rooted in our indigenous and cultural ways of being in relationship with ourselves and the world facilitates both resiliency and the healing of soul wounds caused by historical trauma. So this study seeks to understand how Black women experience historical and intergenerational trauma in relation to and in conjunction with embodied spiritualities in order to identify strategies for intergenerational healing. So this dissertation addresses the fundamental question: how do Black women use embodied spiritualities to heal the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma? So to provide some background and context, I want to talk to you a little bit about the legacy of our trauma. So Black women generationally suffer from unique abuses inflicted on their bodies that, according to Angela Davis, are grounded in the ruthless economic exploitation of their labor, which is born from a legacy of colonialism and slavery. The egregious, profitable, systemic abuse of Black women's bodies invokes both historical and contemporary trauma. So ravaged by physical, spiritual, and psychological wounds inflicted by the commodification of our bodies, Black women often find themselves dispirited and dismembered from our bodies, which is the site of a tremendous amount of generational pain and suffering. The resulting soul wounds, and soul wounds are unresolved injuries of the spirit. They live and breathe in our bodies and can be silently transmitted to the next generation like an undetected disease. And so there are several Black feminist scholars and activists that speak extensively about the historic and chronic traumatization of Black women's bodies. And just to name a few, I already mentioned Angela Davis, Akia Bernard, M. Sean Copeland, Cynthia Dillard, Joy DeGruy, Bell Hooks, Dorothy Roberts, and et cetera, et cetera. So however, though, with the exception of Black feminist scholarship, there is little research that focuses on the intersections between historical trauma, health, soul healing, and spirituality in an effort to identify solutions for intergenerational healing. And so I read a couple of these quotes, And so Angela Davis says, in the eyes of slaveholders, slave women were not mothers at all. They were simply instruments guaranteeing the growth of the slave labor force. They were breeders, animals whose monetary value could be precisely calculated in terms of their ability to multiply their numbers. And M. Sean Copeland, she really makes a critique on capitalism and Black women's bodies in today's culture. She said, Black women's bodies, sex and sexuality, minds and culture have been colonized by both white and Black communities. And so I enter this research by giving you a little bit of information about who I am. I am Kimberly, daughter of Elaine, granddaughter of Thelma, granddaughter of Lucy, great-granddaughter of Wamazetta. And I enter this discussion on historical and intergenerational healing and empowerment as a Black woman, mother, grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, sister, auntie, niece, lover, and friend. And in addition, I am a spiritual teacher, scholar, author, healing practitioner, spiritual activist, and descendant of the ancient African Sibyls. I have both suffered and inflicted harm as a result of historical and intergenerational trauma, and I am a progenitor of soul-to-soul healing. So according to Patty Hill Collins, Black feminist thought encourages Black women to define themselves in an effort to seek validation in a society that constantly and consistently denigrates our worth, value, and experiences. And so thereby I acknowledge that my Black female body is a site for resisting oppression, and I consciously use embodied experiences as an epistemological framework from which to build upon this scholarly research project. And so that's a little bit about me and how I enter this work. And so some of the key terms that I use throughout this study, and I'll also be using it here in this presentation that I want to draw your awareness to. The first one is healing. And so healing is a holistic endeavor that preserves, restores, and transforms vital life force energies found in the natural and supernatural worlds. And it's done through physical, mental, social, and spiritual processes of recovery, repair, renewal, and transformation. And so healing is an emergent process of the whole system and may or may not involve curing ailments. So I want to make that clear as well. The next term, intergenerational trauma, is the unconscious transmission of parents' post-traumatic effects of trauma to their offspring. So thus children may unknowingly live out their parents' trauma retentions through nonverbal, non-conscious mechanisms like psychic memory, epigenetics, behavior modeling, and energy transmission without ever having direct exposure to that traumatic event. The next definition, historical trauma, it is cumulative unresolved trauma that is produced by the sanctioned dehumanization, torture, rape, subjugation, oppression, and assassination of entire groups of people who share a collective identity, ethnic, national, racial, religious, or sexual identities. The next one, embodied spiritualities, are just embodied spiritual practices. These practices originally belong to a pre-slavery colonial African people or those that were created after slavery and colonization as replicas or continuations of these ancestral spiritualities, either in or outside of Africa. I got this term or expanded upon this term from scholar activist Kizito Chinode Nwakis and his concept of indigenous spiritualities, which honors the multifarious practices and expressions of spirituality across Africa and throughout her diaspora. The last term, soul-to-soul healing is a term I coined to represent the intergenerational transmission of soul healing, which uses embodied spiritual practices to remember cultural identities, restore consumed bodies, reclaim embodied spiritual practices, and resist the force of internalized and externalized oppressions. And it is a pathway to individual and collective healing. So I'm going to talk just briefly about the literature I reviewed for the dissertation. And so the literature review took me on an extensive multidisciplinary journey of discovery. So I integrated literature from African-centered psychology, Western psychology, epigenetics, philosophy, religion, spirituality, integral studies, women's studies, African studies, ecofeminist, Black feminist, womanist, and dark feminist studies. So throughout the literature review, I intentionally privileged the voices of Black and Indigenous scholars who are immersed in discourses on spirituality, healing, empowerment, and resistance. And so the literature review was organized in three major themes. The first theme, historicizing Black women's bodies. The second theme is theorizing Black women's bodies. And the third one is spiritualizing and healing Black women's bodies. And so in the first theme, historicizing Black women's bodies, explores the literature that speaks to the historical objectification, dehumanization, sexualization, and commodification of Black women's bodies, and the historical perilous effects of these abuses. So these authors bring to light the origins of historical and intergenerational traumas, which stem from slavery, colonization, patriarchy, and the intersectional effects of racism, sexism, classism, and capitalism. And so again, some of the topics that I looked at, and you all can look at the list, I looked in areas of negative Black stereotypes about Black womanhood. I looked at ideologies and imagery of Black female bodies. I looked at misogyny, misogyneer, the denigration of Black womanhood. So these are just some of the various topics covered there. And I need some water. And so the next theme, theorizing Black women's bodies. So here I investigated literature on how the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma can be passed on to subsequent generations. And so social, psychological, and biological scientists are now discovering that experiences of trauma not only live within the body that has experienced the trauma, the body of the victim, but they can also directly and indirectly affect their offspring for subsequent generations. So not only does intergenerational trauma create pathologies, it also has the ability to morph a child's DNA and predisposition to stress. So in this section, I review literature from historical and intergenerational trauma theorists, psychologists, people who are focusing on epigenetics, and again, Black feminist women in darkened studies in order to examine theories on the transmission of trauma effects. So unfortunately, and this is where my research comes in at, so unfortunately, for the exception of some literature by Black psychology and trauma therapy scholars, it was difficult to find literature that specifically discussed the intergenerational and historical trauma effects and responses experienced specifically by Black women. So in instances where Black women were referenced in some of the mainstream health and psychology literature, it also came along with these same negative stereotypical ideologies of Black womanhood, talking about Black women living in inner cities and impoverished and single mothers and their risky sexual behavior. So these things were reinscribed, but there was very little discussion about the causes and conditions, which are most often rooted in historical trauma. So therefore, to understand more fully the phenomena of historical trauma and the effects, I used a lot of research conducted by Native American researchers, psychologists, scholars, and activists who are theorizing and measuring historical trauma among Native American populations. And so the last section of the literary review explores discourses on spiritualized healing that center spiritual, ancestral, and cultural reclamation, spiritual activism, embodiment, and traditional medicine. And so this dissertation extends this current research to include an interconnected multi-prism exploration into how Black women navigate the lived experiences of historical and intergenerational trauma through praxis of embodied spiritualities. So I'll talk briefly about the theoretical framework. And so the overarching discipline which advances this study is women's spirituality, and with an emphasis on Black feminists, ecofeminists, and on philosophy and activism. And so to fully examine the lived experiences of Black women's bodies, traumas, and spiritualities, I use what's called a transformative research paradigm, which consists of related frameworks and philosophies and theories that all have a common aim to transform. And this is through collective action, relationships, and partnerships among all the stakeholders involved in the research process. And so this transformative study, it integrates 4 research methods to examine Black women's lived experiences. And so the first one is hermeneutic phenomenology. The second one, Black feminist methodology. The third one, Dark feminist methodology. And then I include historical trauma theory as foundational for this work. So hermeneutic phenomenology, just to explain it briefly, it seeks to find common meaning for shared lived experiences. It is a method to examine and describe attributes of collective human lived experiences without the need to justify, approve, or judge their occurrences. So this method views knowledge acquisition and interpretation as a spiraling nonlinear process in which parts of the information are constantly evolving and being synthesized into the wholeness to understand the overarching experience, lived experience. Black feminist methodology, the second one, it explores the lived experiences of Black women through an intersectional lens to interpret how these experiences are shaped and informed by race, class, and gender. So the foundation of which Black feminist methods are built is on Black feminist thought, which again formulates special knowledge and theories produced by and for Black women, rooted in their self-defined standpoint, which I talked about a little bit earlier when I defined my standpoint. So in dark and feminist methodology, it integrates a praxis of spirituality, and it names the sacredness of research. And it is a holistic methodology in terms of its approach to examining cultural, political, historical, and the spiritual nature of Black women's lived experiences. And the fourth one, historical trauma theory, is grounded in 4 major assumptions. And I want to briefly talk about those assumptions because a lot of this research, really pulls out or is historical trauma theory is foundational for it. And so the assumptions of historical trauma theory is that, number 1, mass trauma is deliberately and systemically inflicted on a targeted group of people by an oppressive dominant population. The second one, trauma is not limited to one tragic event. It is perpetual and it occurs over an extended period of time. The third one, that traumatic events are compounded and experienced universally among all members of the group. And the fourth one is that the magnitude of trauma experiences is so great that they adversely impact every aspect of the collective's lived experiences, resulting in a legacy of physical, psychological, social, and economic disparities that persist across all generations. And so now let's talk about the study and the participation of the study. And so this study was divided into two distinct phases. So in phase one, participants were recruited to complete an initial assessment. And this assessment is one that I pulled together, that I created, and it's called the Black Woman's Historical Trauma Assessment. And it was designed to determine participants' current knowledge or awareness about concepts like historical and intergenerational trauma. The second thing is it assesses the level of exposure to various historically traumatic experiences or events, like over-sexualization of our bodies, objectification of our bodies at a young age, experience with state violence, issues with reproductive health. The third thing I looked at within the assessment was historical trauma responses. So historical trauma responses are common features in response to historical trauma. So some of them may include chronic anxiety, fatigue, mental or emotional imbalances. And then lastly, I looked at the spiritual practices of potential participants. Did they embody or have other spiritual practices that went beyond just going to church on Sunday? Did they have other embodied practices like meditation or perhaps breath work or movement or ancestral work, yoga, root work, etc.? And so for phase one, 63 Black women, self-identified Black women who resided in the United States and who were 18 years of age or older completed the assessment. And then based upon the completion of that assessment, I selected 8 participants to go on to phase two, which are the semi-structured interviews, where they were asked more detailed questions about their lived experiences in the areas of spirituality, historical and intergenerational trauma, and intergenerational healing. And so this chart shows the breakdown, because it was also very important that I got participants who represented the generational groupings. And so for the baby boomers, I had 2 participants. The Generation Xers, I had 2 participants. The millennials, I had 3 participants. And Gen Z, I had 1 participant. And so those are the pseudonyms. I kind of want to call that out too, that these are not the actual names of the participants. These are pseudonyms to protect their identities. Resource break, if you don't mind. And so I briefly touch upon phase one research findings because there was some pretty significant things that came out of the assessment. And so when we look at embodied spiritual practices, the participants talked about meditation, prayer, writing and journaling, breath work, using crystals, yoga, energy healing, dreaming, ancestral reverence. So these kind of were in nature reverences. So these were in order of the top 10 embodied spiritual practices that came out of the assessment. The second category, when I looked at assessing historical and intergenerational trauma, I found that 58% of those who took the assessment reported to feelings of having disdain or discomfort about their bodies. 55% had feelings of disconnection from their mothers, which was very interesting. 52% experience having their bodies over-sexualized at a young age, and 42% experience issues with their reproductive health. And lastly, 40%, which is also a very large number. I only highlighted here some of those areas that had high percentages. So 40% experience sexual assault as a minor by a family member or friend. And so that is so alarming. And then the next section, when I talk about historical trauma responses, again, the way that we often respond to trauma, number one was 100%, everybody who completed the assessment, exhaustion and fatigue, reported to having exhaustion and fatigue. The second one was Black Superwoman syndrome. The third, internalized self-hatred or insecurities. Fourth, chronic anxiety. And fifth, unresolved, unprocessed grief. And so just to tell you a little bit about just the Black Superwoman syndrome, because some of you may not be familiar with it, but it describes Black women's experiences of taking on multiple roles: mother, nurturer, breadwinner, all of these things out of economic and social necessity. And so the impetus behind the Black women syndrome is this ideology of inherent survivalism. And it's rooted in strength and resiliency. So often this syndrome leads to where Black women are actually dehumanized and viewed as these superhuman beings. And we are not given the space to rest, to grieve, to feel, to create boundaries, or to care for our physical and mental health and wellness. And so as you can see, those numbers, it makes sense. Of 94% experience this. The outcome of that is internalized insecurities, unworthiness, chronic anxiety, unresolved grief, because you don't have the time and the spaciousness for really healing your mind, body, and spirit. And so those were from phase one, the assessment. And so all the rest of the findings that I'll talk about really center the 8 participants, the Divine 8, the cohort that I interviewed and for the more detailed findings. And so in phase 2, in order to address that overarching research question, I asked or went into detail. These are not the specific interview questions, but kind of a broader categories of questions that I asked. But 4 main questions. The first one, and this is how the rest of the findings of the research is organized. So it's important to note that. Quick resource break. So the first one, how do Black women define and experience their spirituality? The second question, how do Black women integrate embodied spiritualities into their daily lived experiences? The third one, how do Black women experience historical and intergenerational trauma? And the fourth question, how do Black women interrupt the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma to realize intergenerational healing? And so again, the findings that are categorized by question, and what I'll go into next is some of those findings that the key themes rather for some of those findings. And so for how do Black women define and experience spirituality, the key themes there were through an amalgamation of spiritual practices, relationally through interconnections and intraconnections, and the third one is complicated. And so all the study participants intimate that the way that they define and experience spirituality is dynamic, is varied, and it's nonlinear. They express that they live their spirituality out loud in the way that they show up in the world, through creating, through teaching, through mothering, through experiences. And they find that their spirituality is integral to their everyday lived experiences. And because of that, they are immersed in a multitude of practices. And so I'll share some of the feedback or the quotes. So Hope states that I figured out my own path of what works for me and what doesn't work, what I can handle and what I don't want to mess with at all. And I don't specifically subscribe myself to a certain practice. So several of the participants also explicitly stated that they experienced spirituality as a practice of liberation. And so for Black women who are consistently victimized by systemic oppressive power structures in their everyday life, including religion, spirituality becomes a conscious act of resistance, a way that they can reclaim their bodies and their identities. And so Callie states that my spirituality is the practice of liberation. And I believe liberation exists in the body and allows the mind to imagine. And so my spirituality is my spirit that lives through my body, which was taken away from me generations before. I actually just take the time and I'm with my body every day. I trust my body. And as I trust my body, my mind opens up to imagine a new future. So that's my practice. So what I found interesting was that a lot of the not a lot, I only had two, the baby boomers in the study expressed to having a complicated relationship with spirituality. And this was as a result of their ingrained and instilled beliefs in their Christian and religious doctrines and practices. And so on one hand, they were excited about reclaiming or going through the process of reclaiming their ancestral and indigenous spiritual practices. However, on the other hand, they had some discomfort and even guilt around engaging in spiritual practices that are often demonized by family, friends, community, and the Black church as a whole. And so some aspects of the Black church. I don't want to generalize. And so Brenda expresses that she often feels like she's cheating on God by talking to spirit. She also stated that as a Black community, you got to be careful talking about spirits and wearing beads and burning incense. You know how we are, you know how the community is, you know how your sisters and brothers are, you know you crazy as batshit crazy, don't you? And so she said that she would just keep a lot of her practices to herself as a result. And so the second question, so how do Black women integrate embodied spiritualities into their daily lives, into their daily lived experiences? And so four main themes came out of that through spiritual practice and rituals, through ancestral and spirit communications, for healing, liberation, and empowerment, and for protection. And so I'll discuss only a few of them. And so all 8 participants, everybody said that they, again, live their spirituality out loud. And so Callie expresses experiencing spirituality through the daily practices of connecting with and trusting her body. She says that I start generally with my inner child work in the morning. And so I ask my inner child, what is it? What is it that you need from me today? And before I do anything with anyone else, I just sit and wait for her to answer. And that's how I start my day. She says another practice is going to work out. Another practice is breath work, just allowing her body to breathe and seeing what's coming up for her. She says, I tried my best to create an atmosphere for her to speak. She said, drinking water is a practice. Walking outside is a practice. And then my work in the world is a practice. Because I connect to my ancestors and guides through my body, and they speak very loudly, I can connect to others. And so Sasha, she talks about integrating her spiritual practices into her daily life to cope with the stressors of being an overwhelmed mother in an emotionally abusive relationship. She says that spending time in prayer and speaking positive affirmations, reflecting on whatever energy you have and putting it into good. It's like if it's a bad energy you feel, or you feel yourself going into a dark place, replacing that energy with positive energy to reset yourself. And so for me, it's my daughter's room. I would sit in there and spend dedicated amount of time to pray and to meditate. Now, Tiana, who is a voodoo priestess, she points out that voodoo is a nature-based religion, and that voodoo simply means spirit. So she explains using the power and understanding human nature through a spiritual connection with Mother Earth's natural cycles. And she says, when you're in a nature-based practice, you have an understanding of nature and how it works and the cycles of life and what happens when we ignore our nature, when we ignore what makes us us. Why are Black women seen as incredibly strong? It's that deep-rooted connection to all of creation, the original mother, the birther of every fucking thing. We are the we, and that's the beauty of it all. And so Keisha, she also finds her spirituality in nature. She said, I'll go lay under the moon. I'll lay in the sun, and I run to the beach randomly. I don't care what time of the year it is. I'm like, y'all don't understand. This is where we were enslaved at. You are connected to these waters. This is where you came in at. You need to go back to where it started. And so she says, I'll go back to where it started consistently. I wash my head in the water. I lay out there. I can't swim worth a damn, but I'm not scared of it. I learned to find peace in these practices. And so the study participants also spoke about engaging in ancestral communications, which assists them in remembering their identities and lineages. And so Kelly describes writing to her ancestors. She says, I would write to them and I would say, I know that this happened. I know that you weren't able to love like this. I know that you had to hide yourself so that you wouldn't be burned at the stake. I absolutely hear you. I absolutely hear that your disdain for white women came from them stepping on your back. I get it. And we don't have to carry that anymore. And so lastly, the women affirm ways in which their embodied spiritualities help them remember their innate power housed in their Black female bodies. Tiana states that we are creators, we are God. So that's one thing that I look at Abrahamic religions that it doesn't give you. They say you were made in the image and likeness of God. No, you're a God. There are levels to this. You are a creator. You have free will. You do what you want. But what can you bring that's going to be the best for you in the world? And Callie praises her Black female body, stating that it is the most powerful way that I could have chosen to be in this world. I don't know what it's like to be in another body, but the way that I can connect to my grandmother, the way that this Black body every day is in direct opposition. It's something that I'm around and I'm still out here thriving. Like it shows me that Blackness is the gift. And Hope speaks to how her practices assist her in reclaiming her voice as a Black woman. The third question, how do Black women experience historical and intergenerational trauma? So at this point, and I want to take some water, but I also want to give you a trigger warning because it's here that I'm going to speak about some of the depths of some of the trauma that the women have experienced. And I thank them for their courage in sharing. And so 6 main themes that came out: familial wounding, societal wounding, spiritual wounding, internalized wounding, partner wounding, and wounding mother. And so for the sake of time, I'm only going to elaborate on a few of these major themes because there is so much to unpack here when it comes to exploring Black women's lived experiences of historical and intergenerational trauma. And so now I'll look at the familial wounding and also a little bit around societal wounding. So Black women's first exposure to the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma begins within the wombs of their mothers and in the margins of their families. So research has found that babies can inherit trauma retentions and expressions directly from the mother's womb, which directly affects the fetus of a developing body. So the effects of familial wounding are detrimental to the way in which Black women navigate their place in the world. And so this familial wounding that I'm talking about, it engenders many forms, from experiencing or witnessing parental and or familial, physical, mental, emotional, sexual abuse, abandonment, survivalism, and family violence. And so the majority of all the participants did disclose experiences of growing up in mentally and or physically abusive households. They expressed both compassion and resentment towards their mother's inability to protect them and their siblings. They resented their mothers for failing to leave abusive relationships, yet they held compassion for their mother's pain and suffering. However, as a byproduct of witnessing their mothers suppress and silence their wounds was this extinguishing of their own voices and suppressing of their own pain. And so Callie said, I learned to separate from what somebody was doing. I dissociated what they did to me. I just became a sacrifice to anybody I was related to. Absorbing pain was my superpower. And so the participants observed how pathologies of abuse, neglect, and abandonment, which they witnessed and experienced in their home as children, were repeating themselves in their own lives. And this is the intergenerational aspect of it. And as such, as a result of these repeated patterns, the women were now witnessing some of those same patterns being reenacted by their children and grandchildren. And so Sharon explained, she says, my mother was in a relationship with somebody who mistreated her. She did not know how to speak for herself. She didn't know how to defend herself or her daughters from his rage. And I totally recognized that my marriage was the replication of all of that, of me not knowing, not having a voice, me being shut down, just retreat and freeze. Evelyn also shares a similar experience, saying, I watched my mother choose abusive boyfriends. She would always fight her way out of it. She would always get rid of them. I picked the same pattern. And I kind of watched my daughters pick that pattern too. But they also picked the same pattern of breaking that pattern and getting out of their situation. So I watched my mother pick abusive boyfriends and she got out. I picked abusive men, I got out, and I watched my daughters do the same. So in the case of Sasha, she described a violent and painful encounter with her 64-year-old aunt, whom family suspect suffers from mental illness. She states that from her pulling out my hair and beating me, this was somebody that somewhat raised me too as a child. You know, she always had a temper, but no one in the family ever addressed it. I don't think anyone ever knew how to address it, to be honest. So when I went through what I went through, being jumped on, the way my family responded, it was like, you know, this is what she does, you know, get over it, you'll be okay, that kind of energy. And so now I want to explore the theme of societal wounding. And so all of the participants, they expressed a myriad of traumatic experience and retentions as the result of the societal wounding rooted in historical trauma. And so when we talk about historical trauma, the one thing that Kelly expressed to me, she says that although historical trauma is identified as historical, it is a wound that feels very present in my body. And so when we think about fractured identities, sexual objectified and unprotected bodies, workplace traumas, and negative stereotypes, these are the things that I'm speaking of when I talk about the societal wounds experienced by these women. And so each participant spoke about the trauma they endured as the intentional suppression and bastardization of Black and African histories, which results in lost and fragmented identities and spiritualities. And so Evelyn states that the historical trauma I experienced as a child, not really having the freedom or the feeling of not knowing where you came from, going through life rootless because there were no records. There was no history. Enslavement left you ruthless, and having that legacy be passed down that you were less than because you're Black. Your life doesn't matter. And Sharon says that in a psychology program for family therapy, We do what's called a genealogy, which is a family tree, and these all have and these are, to be honest, they have been painful. First of all, never having thought about it. Second of all, to hear other people that can go to the great, 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 and I don't have any of that. I can't go beyond my grandpa. And Tiana argues that the demonization of our histories, spiritualities, and ancestral connections is intentional, and it is a tactic that oppressors use to keep us in perpetual bondage. So another prevalent aspect of societal wounding experienced by Black women is the hyper-objectification and sexualization of their bodies by society as a whole, inclusive of their own Black men. And as a result, they are constantly fighting for agency over their bodies. And so Keisha explains her sometimes disdain for the role that many Black men play in denigrating Black women and elevating white women as the gold standard of class, status, and beauty. She said, you'll meet or see out anywhere a Black man that's married to a white woman and they'll approach you. And I'm like, you're with your preferred, but you're literally over here in my face because you want me to accept your dick as a consolation fucking prize. She said, I have friends that only date white women and they love to fuck Black women. Excuse my language, but that's what she said. Sharon admits that she has been objectified and sexualized by Black men who consider her by men, not just Black men, who consider her Black female body and large butt to be salacious, exotic, and thus commodifiable. She says, this speaks to the specific kind of harassment I get, and it's painful, and it defines the way we are objectified, as we are bodies to be consumed, and not to mention my butt. Like, I can't even tell you how much I hear about my butt. And I'll let you read the rest of the quote. Because I'm trying to rush through, I just have a few more slides. And so how do Black women interrupt the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma to realize intergenerational healing? And so now let's lighten it a little bit, right? And so 5 major things. Well, no, you know what? I want to go back. I take that back. It is one point that I really want to make. I don't want to leave this out. I want to talk about workplace trauma, because in talking about the excessive objectification of Black women's bodies, and these things actually play a role in the overconsumption of our bodies in the workplace. I have to name this. I don't want to skip past this part. And so the vast majority of the study participants shared experiences of being wounded in the workplace. And so the societal wounding of workplace trauma, it often leaves Black women feeling disrespected, manipulated, and overconsumed. And so the participants, all the participants, spoke about experiences of being passed up for promotions, having their authority repeatedly questioned and circumvented, having to train less qualified white colleagues. And so I do want to share this quote from Brenda. She said, I ended up training my manager, who was this little white boy out of college or somebody's nephew or some shit, for a job that I had been doing for a couple of years. I prayed I would get another position because I felt I could not work for this person. And I ended up still working for this person for about a year until another job opened up and I took it. And he was like, I don't want you to go. You're so valuable to the team. And I was like, fuck you and your team. And so this was just one of the many narratives. And I didn't want to gloss past that, because workplace trauma is a huge thing. And it's also an area that when I talk about additional research that I want to be able to focus on a little bit in more detail. So now the 4th question, how do we interrupt it? Where do we go from here? And so 5 major
By
things.
all means, you're in this lane. Get to the other lane, woman.
Oh, somebody on mute. I got scared. I'm like, who is that talking to me? Okay, so 5 major themes evolved from how do we begin to realize intergenerational healing. Now, first one, acknowledging trauma, Second one, learning and education. Third, empowering and mastering self. Fourth, empowering children, conscious mothering. And fifth, engaging in spiritual practices and rituals. So as I said before, I'm only going to touch upon a few of these themes for time. And so the question in terms of how do we interrupt the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma, we have to acknowledge it. And so Tiana says that healing trauma is to create that clean slate within yourself where you can acknowledge this happened. It happened to me, but it wasn't me. That's how somebody treated me does not define who I am. What somebody thinks about me doesn't define who I am. All the study participants espouse that intergenerational healing is built upon a foundation of knowledge, education, knowledge of self, and these things provide Black women with a means to both survive and thrive. And so what I found was that many of the women, they embarked on their own independent self-study journeys to acquire this hidden knowledge, this suppressed knowledge about their identities, about their roots and place and body and spirit. And as such, they grounded their intergenerational healing as collective in a process of knowledge, of knowing, of reclaiming self, of understanding their ancestral cultures and getting back to nature. And so they spoke about learning herbalism, looking at traditional medicine, or learning, reclaiming the aspects of traditional medicine, indigenous spiritualities, and various healing arts. And so Hope shares that she started off with looking at Wiccan. And so she found these witch books, spell books, crystal magic, and stuff like that. And she just started collecting crystals and learning about different personalities, voodoo, and African spiritual practices. And so using what works for her to help heal. And so Callie, she went to various countries to learn different cultural practices and expressions. And she says she wants to be able to freely engage and explore again, take what works and leave the rest. Okay. And you all can read some of those quotes on your own. And so for Black women, intergenerational healing is also predicated upon them taking their power back from their overworked, overstressed, overconsumed bodies through rest, restoration, and retreat. Society normalizes the chronic consumption of Black women's bodies and energies. And so these women share experience of reclaiming their bodies and subsequently unlocking places for creativity, for joy, for power, for passion, for creating healthy boundaries. And I'll share Keisha's quote: "I got boundaries for everything, for myself, for others. I no longer live with expectations because I think I was the expectation girl. I expected all of these things and now I expect nothing but for me to do what I need to do." And Tiana talks about when you find out who you are and you know what your boundaries are and you're healed and you're healing, you fare better, you live better, your mental health is better, your life is better. And she also talks about, which I think is very important, is creating this internal environment of peace. She talked about in her household, and you all can read the last quote, I'll just paraphrase it for time, is, she talks about, she creates an environment, a household where people say good morning, where people speak, where they don't raise their voices. There is no yelling and arguing and fighting. And she created that from being in a household of dysfunction where she did have all of that. And so it is creating new ways of being in relationship, even within your internal environment, even within your household. And so lastly, I do want to touch very briefly upon this theme of empowering children, conscious mothering, because it's so very important that to interrupt intergenerational trauma and historical trauma, we have to be mindful not to reinscribe those same patterns on children. And so the women did speak extensively about ways in which they offer their children agency, ways in which they listen to their children, ways in which they support their children in giving them agency over their voices and their bodies. And I'll just share, you all can read the other quotes, but I'll just share Keisha's quote. She said, "I have a Black son and I talk to him about consent. I'm that parent. I don't post my kids on social media unless I ask for consent. That's how I taught them consent. But I also feel like that's the way that I'm trying to break the trauma that I experienced. I want them to feel that they have control over something so they can feel comfortable asserting themselves to state what they like and what they don't like." And so in conclusion, I'm wrapping it up now. The testimonies of the research participants in this study demonstrate that Black women do in fact suffer from unique and compounding internal and external traumatic woundings by nature of their race, gender, sexuality, and by the historical and contemporary overconsumption and commodifications of their bodies. And as such, we need to continue this discourse in which we center the lived experiences of Black women. And so this study also examined the potential that embodied spiritualities have to reconstitute Black women's bodies, to give them the power to resist, restore, remember, and reclaim their divinity. Because as Black women heal, they heal everyone connected to them. And so I'll share also a few of the limitations. The first one, chronic health conditions and health disparities. Unfortunately, as part of the interview process, I did not ask specific questions around their current health and any chronic health conditions. And this is important because we can now start beginning to link historical and intergenerational trauma to some of the health disparities and health conditions that Black women tend to disproportionately suffer from, like arthritis, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, etc. Another area that the study didn't really focus on that could have been elevated more is mental health. And so although it wasn't a particular theme, and that's because the Black women did not talk specifically about themselves suffering from chronic mental health issues, they did talk about family members, but they did share experiences of suicide ideations or attempts, and they attribute them to being overburdened, overconsumed, and stressed. And then the last one, limited participant size. Again, the second phase of the study, which was more the semi-structured interviews, the longer interviews only had 8 participants. So I don't want to like overgeneralize the study and all Black women feel this way, but this again is rooted in the size of the population specific for this study. Lastly, recommendations. I came up with some theoretical, professional, and practical recommendations. Theoretical, we need to extend historical trauma theory to include the lived experiences of Black women. As I had mentioned before, they're pretty much focused on Native American population, Holocaust survivors, and there are even a couple of studies that look at African Americans as a collective, but again, not specifically the unique lived experiences of Black women. That along with epigenetic studies. So as we get involved in epigenetics, and that's the study of environment, again, more focused research specifically on Black women. From a professional standpoint, a lot of research and psychology is really starting to look at historical trauma as a thing, but again, centering Black women's lived experiences, centering what are some of our historical trauma responses, so culturally relevant therapies and ways that we can learn healing circles, retreats, workshops, things like that. Because Black women, we heal in community. And then lastly, some practical applications that came out of the research findings that a lot of the women suggested. Again, becoming more knowledgeable about historical and intergenerational trauma, knowledge of self and their lineages, really understanding and becoming more versed on their mother's wounds and her mother's wounds, getting acquainted, getting reacquainted with Mother Earth, exploring nature, going out in nature, feeling your body, giving yourself permission through movement, feeding your body with life-affirming foods, and developing a relationship with the ancestors. Areas really quickly, further research. I talked about health disparities and disease, intergenerational familiar traits, being able to really research and look at 3 subsequent generations of women is really important to understand what traits are being passed down and what traits have been healed, that have been removed from the family line. Again, studying more in depthly on mental health and how historical and intergenerational trauma affects mental health. Really looking at workplace trauma. Like, this is a huge, huge area that meant that Black women are really suffering on the job and in their workplace. And then I also would like to do more research on Black women outside of the United States. As a result of colonization and enslavement across the diaspora, these Black women may have similar embodied trauma responses and experiences that require intervention. And so looking more depthly at Black women's lived experiences outside of the United States. And so this slide is just some of the references that I use within this presentation. And that's it. I'm finished. I am done. I apologize for all the initial hiccups and delays again. So thank you. Thank you.
I'll wait for you to stop sharing your screen, but thank you so much, Kimberly. That was really wonderful. It was really this thorough exposition of your research at looking at depth at the complexity and the pain of historical and intergenerational trauma in Black women, and also looking at the embodied spirituality as spiritual activism and a practice of healing, liberation, and reconnection. So thank you so much for your research. Thank you so much for your work. There's much gratitude. So the next phase will be for the committee. Yes, take a breath. Have some water. To ask you some questions about your research. And there'll be 2 rounds of questions. And I'd like to begin with Dr. Venus Evans.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. That was a fascinating presentation. It was a fascinating presentation. And I noticed that you apologized for the slow start, the tech difficulties, and you apologized a lot. You don't have to, Kimberly. I just wanted to state that. You do not have to. I was just watching, your guests' feedback, and they were telling you, it's cool, we got this, just sit with it, we're your support team. But I think that your opening, your beginning, even some of the apologies represent the purpose of your research. And I think, Dr. Williams and Dr. Aurora, this is what happens when we began to diversify the academy. And I mean diversify it from an epistemological perspective as well as an onto-epistemological perspective, right? We're willing to wait. Whose time are we on? We're willing to support you, right? And without apology, because that's how we shift and transform these entities that have not protected us, to the point of your last slide. So with that said, I want to thank you for that, my sister, and all of that purple lipstick you're wearing. You throughout, I've read your, I've been, I've had the privilege of reading your work and being in conversation with you from start to finish, even when it appears that I hate email. So you've been so patient. But with that said, um, I have little critique and feedback. I want to start with the positive. And one, your concepts, like how you deconstruct or unpack taken for granted concepts or constructs in the very beginning of your work, right? So me seeing you evolve over the last 2 or 3 years and not taking any of these concepts for granted. I feel like you've taken these traditional scientific terms, psychological concepts, even religious or spiritual terms, and you've reframed them in the way that they make sense to us, right? Somebody like Dr. Dillard or others might say, Dr. Dr. Joy, you even brought them back home because maybe they were taken from us to begin with and just renamed and rephrased. So I wanted to say that. Thank you for almost giving us a thesaurus of sorts, if not an encyclopedia of terms. Also, your lit review was off the chain. Okay. The first thing I was saying, I'm like, how did you do all of this post-pandemic? During the pandemic? Yes, that's my dog walking behind me on the couch. Get down. The puppy. So sorry. Now here we go. I was trying to like feed them treats to keep them occupied. But your literature review, I believe, is outstanding, right? And I think that you gave a lot of attention to it. And I think that some of the faculty, even I've been in the game for 20 years now, and it's interesting to me because I think sometimes students want to push past that literature review, but you did a deep dive across disciplines, psychology, cultural studies, ethnic studies, transnational feminism, you indigenous studies, right? So you try to be fair, not for consumption purposes, but to be fair and to give credit to these various forms of ideologies, right? And I think that's interesting. That says a lot about who you are. And so I kept thinking from a methodological perspective. I just kept, right, because, so I don't know if the team knows this, the committee may know this, but I actually tend to find myself, I say that I am a theoretician who studies methodologies, right? But I find it fascinating from a methodological perspective. I was trying to, I'm like, is she just literally studying the various ways of collecting Black women's stories? And I just imagine you just waking up and say, I'm gonna sit with this, I'm gonna pray over this, I'm gonna meditate over this, I'm going to study it. So I did want to also acknowledge that lit review. I also wanted to acknowledge the approach to mixed methods. I personally didn't see that coming. I just knew, I was like, oh, she's gonna just collect stories. But then you use that tool, the Black women's historical trauma assessment, which I thought was very clever and sophisticated and patient, very patient of you. And lastly, I believe that you certainly have contributed to what we still don't know but need to know about embodied practices. Yeah. And so if I may, Dr. Williams, is this the time where I ask the questions or should I wait? Okay. Sorry, I know every institution and program does something differently, so I just.
Yeah. Oh, yes, go ahead, please.
Okay. So one question that I did have is, I actually thought, Kimberly, that I would see more of you in the study. Is there a reason why you chose to decenter yourself or not to make yourself as the researcher part of the inquiry process?
Yes. And so when I looked at the phenomenological methodology and the idea of kind of bracketing or taking yourself out of it. Because I am a Black woman, because I am a spiritualist, because these are very similar to my own personal lived experiences, I did not want to muddy the water, so to speak. I wanted it to be the voices of other Black women versus, centering myself in the work. And so.
Okay. Which probably aligns with your choice to use Brocula theorist as like a way of seeing and interacting with your participants. And I think that's interesting, right? Because, and I want you to think about this, like, as you think about the implications of the study, because I think from a African-centered perspective, a Pan-African perspective, one of the challenges we've always had is that the voyeurism in our research, and what happens when I become a part of the research community as the researcher and the researched. And when you flip, right, when you flip that lens and you become just as vulnerable, as well as, I don't know, what's the word? Not just vulnerable, but you become as transparent, right, as your participants. And because you and I have had so many conversations, I know one of the challenges is, how do we move away from what's traditionally considered valid and objective, right? Because we're still objectifying marginalized bodies and people, right? As opposed to making us the full participants in the study. But I thought you navigated that well, and I think your response is perfect. So a follow-up question was, how can these healing practices inform our understandings? And yeah, I'm just gonna leave it there. Our understandings of scientific inquiry.
Yeah. So I think more studies like this that really look at those that realistically look at spiritual practices as a part of research and inquiry. And, so when we think about meditation and energy healing, in an academic standpoint, and these things are still viewed as like out there, not practical, not measurable. And because of that, a lot of cadence, so a lot of researchers won't pick that up as a topic or as something they want to delve into, because it's not viewed as credible. And so it's this credibility thing that spiritual practices or spiritual phenomena is real, that these are actual lived experiences. And so when I am in meditation, I am having an experience. I'm building relationships with source. I'm building relationships with ancestors. These things are happening. But in order to understand that these things are happening, we have to talk about it. And having participants talk about their lived experiences with the participant who says she writes to her ancestors, this is what she says, and this is what they tell her. That's real. And so being able to codify that in research, in writing. And so I think the more that we see studies like this, the more that people share these courageously share these experiences, then we can get to the point, and hopefully that answered your question out, the point of understanding these practices as scientific, so to speak.
Yeah. So Kimberly, I think you answered both questions or responded to both questions meaningfully, because I think that what we're in search of when we're investigating the social world, especially Black women's and other Indigenous people's experiences, is that relational part, so that we're not simply specimens on a tray, And that is the spiritual part that we just can't quite get to in our scientific pursuits, especially institutionalized research. And so I think you definitely bring that forward through the tools that your participants were drawing upon. And that's what I felt and I experienced in your write-up, right? And so the other question I had, because I do have my feet in two worlds, that of having to teach research and policy, right, to grad students, doc students, and helping policymakers understand it, right? That's the work I have to do at the think tank with other Black girls. And I would also say, you had stated that your research, or you didn't really, your participants didn't really discuss mental health issues, but I think they are. And of course, that's the next step when you have time, right, for your follow-up study, when this moves towards publication. It is a conversation on mental health, right? We're using different words to describe what we're experiencing and what we're going through. So I think that spiritual practices, you're showing this through your research, that spiritual practices are mental health practices. Spiritual practices are mental health practices, which are cultural and knowledge seeking practices, right? So I think that is it is some of that conversation. So the question that I have for you is, how can Black women's ritual work, challenge taken for granted assumptions about mental health practices like talk therapy, psychoanalysis, or even cognitive behavioral therapy?
Yeah. I think that the biggest thing is the awareness that that is exactly what we are doing. What I have noticed, and I just completed a somatic therapy certificate class, but what I noticed is a lot of the practices that are natural to us, being in community, having Black women circles, a lot of these things are practices of mental and physical. These are therapeutic practices, but they are not seen as that in mainstream. I always talk about people finding your medicine, and that medicine can be in talk therapy, it can be in dance, it can be in walking, and so like some of the participants, just their everyday practices. So there has to be a shift within us to start ritualizing our everyday practices, seeing them as sacred, seeing them as, identifying them as sacred, and not just mundane, or not just I have to do this because I have to do this. And those things that you just have to do, that you are not tied to, that you don't have a passion for, that you don't, maybe those things we start divesting from, where our life, our lived experiences become our sacred practices. Where cooking becomes a sacred practice, a practice rooted in love, and not just I have to do this. Because if it's just I have to do this, that whole, when we talk about mental health, when we talk about being overburdened and overtaxed, if that's something that's causing that, you're not going to see that practice as sacred. And so it's really understanding what our day-to-day, and that's why I talk a lot about integrating these practices into our everyday life, because that is where the medicine is. But you have to identify as that, you have to find it as that. And so hopefully, again, and it's perception, it's not being able, it's being so run down and so overburdened and so consumed that not even seeing a walk around the block as something needed for your mental health, something needed to help you ground, something needed to help you breathe.
That was lovely.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Evans Winters. I'm looking at time. So in the interest of time, this is a conversation that can continue for hours. It's all fascinating. Thank you for your thoughtful questions and your responses, Kimberly. I'd like to move on to Dr. Alka Aurora.
Thank you, Annette. So first of all, I want to say, Kimberly, what a joy to see you defend. I've known you for years, since you began the program, I think. Yeah, so we've been on the journey for a long time. And I want to really acknowledge that I can't overstate the importance of the kind of work that you're doing. You know, when Resma Mamakin's work came out of my grandmother's hands, it was such an important piece of work, and I saw it being, coming into study groups all over the country. And as I read it, I loved the book, but I was like, there's no gendered analysis, because I know the experiences are different, right? Depending on your gender of Blackness, because the racism has been so intertwined with sexism. Yeah. So I just really think your work is so important. One of the things that I want to ask you about is, you talk about a wide array of spiritual practices that your research participants engaged in, and sort of their self-understandings of spiritual beings. So I was wondering if there was some sort of recurring core or essence, right, that you feel is what helps your research participants truly heal, right? So it's more than just like someone can go to yoga every week, but that could just be an exercise, right? Or someone could do a certain ritual or do something. But what is at the essence that really creates that deeper soul healing of these practices?
Oh, wow. That's an amazing question. Thank you. What I found was the biggest thread was knowledge of self. And it's any spiritual practices that get you to be able to connect at an intimate level with who you are, why you are, and your path and your journey in this lifetime. And so I felt like all roads led back to that awareness of self, that embodiment. And so that's why it's so, whatever the practices are, it brings you back into a deeper sacred relationship with self. And so that's what I found, that was the theme of the healing, but it's also the theme of the trauma, of not knowing who you are, where you came from, not being safe in your body. And so I didn't even I didn't talk a lot about protection. And it was amazing to me that coming out the study, so many Black women named feeling unprotected. And so when you don't feel protected and you don't feel safe in your body, this is not a place that's comfortable for you. And so spiritual practices that get you back in here, that get you to breathe, that get you to connect with your body, to get you to calm, to settle, those are the things that really create the space for intergenerational healing, if that answers your question.
Absolutely. And I think that is such a beautiful framing, and that's something you may, it's been a while since I read your conclusion, you may actually want to highlight there, or if, or at least when you bring this into a book, to help your readers and your audiences when you speak about this, really hone in on that essence of sacred knowledge of self. I think that is something that, I definitely resonate with as a non-Black woman, although of course I understand there's very different, histories and particular traumas, and perhaps methods, but I think there's something so key in that framing of sacred relationship with self. And then my follow-up question to that is about the role of Christianity, right? Because I know you and many of your research participants had to step away from a lot of traditional Christian teachings in order to find that sacred relationship with self. And I don't recall if were all of your, if you could speak a little bit to the religious upbringing of your participants. Were they all
Yeah.
Christian, or was there some diversity there?
Yeah.
And then there's another piece to that.
Mhm.
Do you believe that Black women can remain in the Christian church and still develop that sacred relationship to self?
Yeah. So of the participants, the vast majority of them were 60, I think 60, 70% were Christian. It was only 43% that were not. And when I think about religion in itself, so it doesn't matter Christianity, Islam, when I think about religion in itself, I think more about the doctrine and the rules and and spirituality. The one thing I think 90% of them, they do disassociate or separate religion from spirituality. And so I do believe that they can find that within a faith-based, any faith-based practice, Christianity, Islam, because it's not in competition. Being able to embody spiritual practice, being able to see, again, I use the example of hiking or walking, or being able to see that as a sacred spiritual practice, it should not be in competition with your religious belief systems. So yes, I do feel that women, Black women, can reclaim themselves and their identities and their spiritual practices within the confines of Christianity if they give themselves permission to do the knowledge, to go beyond, to research some more, to understand. That's the reason I used the quote from one of the participants who talked about voodoo. And so there's this fear in the Black community that voodoo has been so demonized, and voodoo actually means spirit. And so when we do the knowledge of some of these practices, and we'll find that we're one with that. Like, oh, that means spirit. That means nature. That's earth-based. I'm from the earth. I can go, it's water, it's land. It's, oh, okay. That's not in competition with my Christian belief system or my Christian faith or my Islam faith And so that's our work. Our work is to not demonize our own knowing of self, our own indigenous and ancestral practices. They can live and breathe in the same space within us. It's enough of it to go around. Like, really, it is. So that's my.
Thank you. And just a moment, I know we're running out of time. I think, and I say this not, of course, from personal experience, but from working with Black students from different faiths over the years and from some of my own research. It seems to me that they can coexist as long as the person is not being shamed, like if they're queer, that they're not in a Black church that's like homophobic, or if they are not in a church that's actually, or they're not adhering to or buying into an interpretation of Christianity that is misogynistic or homophobic.
Yeah. But here's the thing: if you are really rooted in spirituality, that it won't resonate with you. If you are really grounded, if you're in your truth, if you're doing your breath work, if you're going to, like, some of those things will don't resonate, and you'll go into the spaces and places that resonate with you energetically. And so that's the work. That's our work.
Thank you. Thank you. Great answer.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Aurora. I'm looking at the time, but I want to, and actually both Dr. Evans-Winters and Dr. Aurora have touched on it, questions that I have. And speaking of that, I'm looking at or thinking about the women who would be most disconnected from spirituality and who are listening to pastors who believe root work is devil adjacent. So it is the piece of education, and I'm thinking about dissemination of your research, and I'm thinking of the places in which these talks need to be had. And how do you see this work getting out there? How do you see it disseminated to reach a wider population of individuals who might not have even thought about these concepts or thought about this connection, between spirituality and how spirituality and many Christian concepts that they're steeped in are connected and or are not contradictory, or at least. So I just wonder if you have given any thought to that.
Absolutely. So some of the areas, one of the things that I noticed with this dissertation, even for myself, I made it very, and I think Dr. Winters alluded to it as well. I made it very accessible, language-wise, practice-wise. Again, breathing, when we're talking about root work. Well, drinking tea, that's a root, And so a lot of times, because of the limited knowledge and knowingness about what spirituality is and what it means to be in the sacred, in the spiritual. So education, I think, is so very key. And to reach more expanded audiences, I definitely want to publish, but I also want to have, workshops and classes and retreats where we really get to the root of what spirituality is. It's a connection. It's self-defined. It's self-authored. It is a connection to yourself. It is a connection to everything that you're connected to. So talking about the interconnections, talking about, okay, you wouldn't have medicine if it wasn't for roots. So you don't believe in root work? Like, where did it come from? What are the origin stories of these practices? And so when we can begin to unpack those things, when I teach Reiki, I talk about the origins of hands-on healing, and so it makes it less spooky, less intimidating, and then talking about the intentional demonization of these practices, so you're not empowered. So you won't be empowered to go any further than what someone is telling you or indoctrinating you to believe. So
thank you, Kimberly. Now I have my list, have like high schools, workshop, church talks,
Absolutely.
vehicles, popular magazines, yes.
You'd be surprised. I did a talk at a church. Kid you not, really quick story. I did a talk in a church about energy work, but I made it it was about chakras, but I made it more about energy, and I asked people how many people were familiar with chakras. It was just a couple of people. It may have been 50 people there. The pastor raised his hand.
Yeah.
But the pastor is not teaching the people about what energy is and energy healing is and what chakras are. But he knew.
Well, Kimberly, I'm going to stop because on the time, I'd like to leave some time for the audience to ask you questions, engage in conversation. And I'll ask V to put, Dr. Evans-Winters, myself, and Dr. Aurora into another Zoom room while that is happening. So while we're away, everyone, please engage in conversation, questions for Kimberly, and then we'll be back.
Thank you so much. Everybody stays put, and the committee goes into the breakout room. Take it away.
Oh my God. That
All right, the last
was
committee member is gone.
amazing. Oh my God.
Who is saying, oh my God, is that Dr. LaTanya?
It is. Oh my
Hey,
God. I am
beautiful.
like, and we just got back from Ghana. So I'm just like, everything that you just said was like, just reinforced. And I was, oh my God, this is so absolutely amazing. So you did phenomenal, period. So I just wanted you to know that, oh my God, Dr. Kimberly, I cannot wait to see the good trouble you getting ready to get into.
Oh,
I can't wait. I can't wait.
Thank you so much.
Kim, I'm gonna just jump in real quick because I'm about to get on the road and transition, try to get to Juma prayer before it's over. But I just want to say I love you. You did phenomenal. I second Dr. LaTanya's comments. I see Dr. Mayenda's about to say something, so I'm gonna let all the doctors say what they need to say. But I just want to say, don't have any thoughts about the recovery. Your recovery was great. You centered the room and regrounded us. And, you know, because a lot of times when you start stumbling, you just keep stumbling. You were able to retract it. You were able to center yourself and the group. And everything you was getting, dropping. Love you, kisses, okay?
I love you. Thank you.
Dr. Kimberly J. All right.
Thank you.
Kimberly, this is Crystal. Can you tell me what the next steps are? Just curious to know what happens next.
In terms of the program or in terms of my work?
In terms of them deliberating in the process.
Oh, well, they're doing that now. And
Okay,
then I need to, I'll be sending the dissertation to our Center for Writing and to a professional editor, and then it'll be published. And then I'll graduate in May.
So when do we officially get to refer to you as Doc? Do I have to call you that?
In just about 2 little minutes.
Today.
As soon as they come back.
Today. In a couple of seconds. That part. Yes, that part.
Wait for it. It's coming.
Yes.
Wow,
Hey,
congratulations. I'll be quiet and let other people speak.
Well,
Hey,
Kimberly, this is Kenya. I'm sorry I'm not on camera. I'm actually working and I probably shouldn't be saying that, but I wasn't going to miss the opportunity to witness what you did here today, my phenomenal, beautiful friend. I'm almost in tears because you knocked it out of the park. You did. I'm so proud of you. I am so proud of you. My heart is so full right now. Congratulations. I jumped the gun. I called you doctor because you're about to be one.
I have my tissue. Y'all know I'm sensitive, right?
Gratitude, Kim.
I love you.
I love you.
Kimberly.
Thank you.
This is Tana. I have been teary the whole time as I sent you up a prayer this morning. This is the day the Spirit has made. We are all rejoicing in the work that you have done, not only the work that you have presented here, but for those of us sisters who've been on the background, those dissertating sisters while Black, who you've helped while in the process, who you've helped while you were doing your work. We are utterly proud of you. I know Medea, I see Drew and the other sisters are on the line who have been in program with you since you started, since we started and all around. Big sis, we proud of you. Here, we are proud of all the work you've done. Your work hinges on our work, parallels with our work. We're all working on spirit and all of these things. You knocked this shit out the park, baby. We love you. We proud of you. Dr. Kimberly J.
Yeah.
Ashe, Kimmy, and real quick, I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful. And you are that shining being, dwelling in the light of the Most High. Runu Punu Ameku Kemam, Kepeder in the third Heyu. I'm so grateful. Congratulations, Dr. Davis. So much love. And Miss Elaine, you see your baby. Let's go. And big up to your sons too. Peace.
I gotta run because I have a client, but I want to echo all that has been said, my sister. There's a joy and celebration, and I can't wait to give you a hug when I see you. I love you so much. Thank you for this important, vital work that you're doing. There is a lot that is going to come out of this work, and I'm already seeing it all. This is just like the beginning. So congratulations for your hard work and for putting our voices and our experiences out there. It's so important. Mwah.
Thank you, Simone. I love you.
Kim,
can you hear me?
Kim.
I can.
I was trying to get a word in edgewise.
Oh,
Thank you so much for your work. You know, we've known each other since our undergrad days, and that was just, you know, putting that all together in your presentation. It means so much, especially for us who have healed our traumas through alternative spirituality. And I just wanted to thank you for your work.
Thank you so very much, beloved. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Can you hear me, Kim?
I can, Kimberly.
Girl, it was so beautiful.
Oh, make me cry. Oh my God.
Girl, I cried the whole time. I saw all of our work I heard voices. I thought about Medea, Drew. I thought about Taylor. Girl, anyway, I'm driving, so I'm gonna go back off. But and I accidentally called you Dr. Kim to Annette 3 days ago. So I broke protocol, but I'm so proud of you, and it was beautiful, Kimberly. It was beautiful.
Thank you so much, beloved. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I'm jumping in. I'm jumping in to say thank you, thank you, thank you for being a possibility example. Like that is what I sat here thinking the whole time as I was taking notes and listening to your work, is that we are possibility examples for each other, and you have been so generous with your work and your time. So I've just been sitting here celebrating, tears also. So proud of you, so happy for you, so grateful to be on the earth at the same time as you, and so looking forward to the future. Dr. Kimberly.
True. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Kimberly.
Hey, my brother. Hey, baby.
Hey, big sis. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you.
And just
so
knowing
much.
how much your work affects other people, and the positivity that you bring, and you know how you can improve the lives of other Black women. This is great. Just so proud of you.
We love you.
Thank you. Is that Melissa? Hey, sis.
Yes,
Thank you.
we love you.
I love y'all. Thank you.
I missed the presentation. I was at work, but you know, I was there. So
I know. And I'll
you're
send it
great.
to you.
It's great. It's great. You deserve it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I would like to say something. Kimberly, that was amazing. I second what Drew was saying. You are like, you're showing us this, we got this, we can do this. I have seen like maybe 5 other defenses. This is the best one I have seen. It was laid out. You spoke so well. Your research was just so powerful. And the impact that it's having like on my life and so many others, it's just you're gonna do amazing things. You're gonna be talking, speaking on TV, magazines, you got this. So good, so good.
Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Hey, I'd be remiss if I didn't say congratulations, sister. I thought your talk was phenomenal, and as a father to a Black young lady, it is definitely eye-opening to see how your work actually helped educate me a lot more on the traumas and in the historical trauma that Black women historically suffer from. So thank you for helping me take a deeper dive and look into that and how I might be able to help shape and mold my daughter as she comes up. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Love you. It was awesome.
I love you, my brother. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you.
Mommy.
Baby.
You did so amazing.
I love you.
And me and the boys have been texting this whole time. Kevin was like, oh my God, could you speak for us? I said, yes, I got you.
Oh, is he on here? I don't see
He
him.
is, but yeah, he is. But you know, he's like in between stuff right now. So I told him that I will speak on behalf of us, that we are so very proud of you. You did amazing.
Thank you, baby. I love you. Thank you for being
I love
here.
you more. You're so amazing.
Thank you.
I guess I can hop in now. Hey, Dr. Kim.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm glad it's
How do you
over.
feel? Like what? Like this is done. Like I remember when you first started the program and you were immediately Dr. Kim to me. I've been calling you Dr. Kim from the beginning. So I'm just Kim, you Davises, I tell you, y'all just do not cease to amaze me. Like you are one of the most brilliant people I've ever came into contact with.
Oh, Tina.
The information, the research, the hard work is over. if nobody tells you thank you, I will tell you thank you for just the dedication that I know that this took. I can only imagine, the days, the tears, the ups, the downs. Like I've been praying for you because I know how something like this is, it's a sacrifice. And, I just want to say thank you for sharing yourself and your mind and your brilliance with, so many people. I can't wait to read the book. Just sitting here, I've never done or participated in anything like this. So this is awesome. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you. I think my mom is on here somewhere. I'm not sure.
Put me on.
You there, Mama?
Hey,
Put me on.
Kimberly. I am so happy for you. Dr. Kimberly Davis.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, we thank God for you. We've known you before all this came about.
Yeah.
So it's really a milestone for us. And I pray that everything that you've done in this lifetime up to now, that God will continue to give you more and better insight and wisdom and understanding concerning spirituality, because it's a great phenomenon. God is a good God. There's nobody like him. And I thank God for you sharing all that you know concerning spirit. There is two spirits now. There's an evil spirit and there's a godly spirit. I thank God that the spirit that you are researching is really both, to give people insight concerning the negative and the positive. And I thank God for you, Kim. And I'm praying that God will continue to bless you, prosper you, and give you plenty of health.
Well, thank you so much. And on that note, Ms. Patricia,
yes,
thank you very, very much. The committee has come together and we have deliberated, and we're back. And it is our pleasure to say that not only has Kimberly passed her dissertation, but she has passed it with distinction. So I would like to be the first to welcome Dr. Kimberly Davis into the circle of PhDs. So welcome, Dr. Davis. Congratulations and wonderful, wonderful work.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, that's not even get the tissues. Now now I'm going to start crying with you. Oh yeah.
Thank you. Oh my God.
Congratulations with distinction, honey.
Thank you,
with distinction.
Thank
Kimberly.
you.
Oh, Donna, it's been a minute since I've seen you.
Thank you.
Phenomenal work, Kimberly. Such a joy.
Thank you so much for pushing me out. For really challenging me to be a better scholar. When I came into this program, I didn't even know how to write. I didn't know how to write at all. So thank you.
You know how to write now.
You can teach. You'll be teaching how to write.
Oh, God. Thank y'all so very much. And for everybody who showed up and showed out in this space, I am forever grateful. My mom says she's in tears right now. Where you at, Ma? I don't even see you on the screen. Mommy, say something so I can see you.
Oh, if you hope she comes off puts her camera on so we can see her.
Ma, I don't
I would love to
see
meet you.
Where's your camera? Hi, Sean Harris. I see you. My high school friend. Hi, Sean. Ma, where you at? Is she still on?
Yes,
Look, my nephew is on, and my niece Kalia, and my son Ma. Come, I want to see you. I guess you're not gonna come on camera. And my cousin Keisha, like all of you all who showed up, Dia, all of you all, thank you so very much.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. I'm looking a mess, so I'm not going to be on camera. But
Okay.
I am so proud of you.
Thank you, Mom.
I love you so much. And whew, I don't even know what to say or what to make of all of this, but I know about the hard work and the sacrifice. And I know as a family, we kind of tried you a little bit, but we've always been proud of you. Always.
Thank you,
So,
Mom.
love you so much.
I love you too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, we're past time, and
Okay.
this has been a wonderful, wonderful dissertation defense and outpouring of appreciation and love for Kimberly, for Dr. Kimberly Davis. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for attending and have a wonderful rest of your day or evening.